Now, I'd very much like to thank our in-association organisations who are supporting this event with publicity. Do check them both out. They do absolutely brilliant work. Northern Soul Kitchen is our local food waste cafe. They take discarded food from supermarkets that would otherwise go into landfill, turn it into delicious food, and sell it on a pay-as-you-feel basis in their cafe here in Berwick. Obviously, that's a little bit different during these times, but they're still working hard to combat food waste. Secondly, Berwick Slow Food Group. Now, Slow Food is all about supporting good, clean, fair food production, and that's celebrated specifically and particularly in Berwick through our annual Food and Beer Festival, which was sadly cancelled this year, but hopefully will be back in the first weekend of September 2021. A final thank you to our sponsor for this event, the ever supportive and generous Simpsons Malt. Now, onto the business that we've all joined together today, this morning for. As you know, we've got Pauline Beaumont, whose book, Bread Therapy, The Mindful Art of Baking Bread, has just been published on both sides of the Atlantic. Now, I just want to share with you something that Dan Leppard, the award-winning baker, food writer, and photographer, says about the book. He says, "It is a reassuring, generous book that answers the big questions of why we bake bread rather than buy, and shows the healing power that crafting and baking a loaf offers us. It's a heartfelt, enlightening book for the baker in your family, your friends, and especially the baker within you." Well, good morning, Pauline.
Hello.
It's great to have you with us. Now, Pauline, she has had a 20-year career in the arts before retraining and taking up her current career in mental health as a student counsellor at Newcastle Uni. I bet that's interesting at the moment, Pauline. Tell us a little bit about how all of your life experience, all of it, that's a big question, but how your life experience has led to you writing this wonderful book.
Okay, well, you're absolutely right to suggest that one of the strands that's gone into the book has been my professional knowledge from my work as a therapist. Obviously, as a therapist, I'm a strong advocate for therapy, and for many of us, it's a wonderful way to recover, to be well. I suppose there's another sense in which recovering, becoming well is always self-help, but it's sometimes self-help with a therapist, sometimes it's self-help without a therapist. Working as a therapist, I've also come to realise, as many others have as well, that there are many things that we can do to help ourselves that are highly therapeutic, but are not therapy. And for me, baking bread has been one of those things. So in writing Bread Therapy, I suppose I've plaited together three strands. As I say, the experiences I've had working as a therapist, there's my own passion for bread making. And then this realization that actually bringing those two things together, I can understand now why it is that it's been such an important thing for me and why it's been so good for my own mental health. And I'm reminded of something. I've got something to show you actually, which is this little frame which I've had on my desk for about 20 years. And I don't know if you do this, Jackie, or anybody else watching, but cutting out and writing down quotations that somehow resonate with us very deeply. And these two quotations really only made sense to me after I'd written the book. And the first one is from Rei Kawakobo, the fashion designer, the founder of Comme des Garçons. And she says, "The only way to try and make something new is to do something extremely personal." So that resonated with me very deeply. Didn't really know what it meant to me, but I had it on my desk. The second one is from the French filmmaker Robert Bresson. And among many other things, he says, "Dig deep wherever you are." And so it's really only after I've written the book that I realized that's exactly what I've done. I've dug deep where I am. My passion for bread making, my professional knowledge, my personal experience of benefiting from it. And when I set off writing the book, I didn't intend to include anything personal in it, but that just came about quite naturally. So yes, those three things I've woven together, and I hope that being that mixture, it sometimes maybe will have a power that it wouldn't have had if it was just a psychology book, if it was just a bread book, or just a memoir.
That's really interesting, Pauline, because obviously we know each other personally. We should say we're friends. We've known each other for a few years now. But one of the things about reading the book, I learned things about you. And I felt that as well as it being well researched, informed and informative and sort of carefully structured, it does feel very personal. And you talk about this sort of tyranny of perfection and using the process of making bread to kind of free your mind and practice some form of self-acceptance for how we find ourselves, where we are. And I just sort of wondered how you'd kind of come to that, what had brought you to that.
One of the fascinating things I've found is that in learning to make bread has taught me things, and the process of bread making. So for all of us, living an examined life is what we need. We need to understand ourselves better. And that's a lifelong process. It's not sort of like painting the time bridge. It is like painting the time bridge. We keep on doing it. It's not tick box, we've done it. So finding a way of accepting our own imperfections is one of the things that we need to do. And it's part of understanding ourselves better. Telling the truth to ourselves that, nobody's perfect. That's an existential reality. We all make mistakes. We're all flawed. And we can't stop and start again. So for good mental health, we need to be able to accept ourselves as we are. And there's something about bread making, which is actually so prone to things going wrong, that it gives you lots of opportunities to practice in this everyday way, accepting things not turning out as expected, things being different. I've got a loaf here to show you as an example of a flawed thing, which is a lovely turmeric and sultana loaf that's meant to have the sultanas beautifully distributed throughout. And for whatever reason, that turned out with all the sultanas stuck in a lump at the top. But you know what? It doesn't matter. So every time something goes wrong when we're making bread, regarding it as an opportunity to learn to get better at accepting small imperfections and small mistakes and small things that don't turn out as expected, actually is a way of helping us to accept our own flaws and our own imperfections. And psychologically, that's a very important step that we all need to take, because it allows us to show ourselves compassion. And that's something that's a very, very important building block of good mental health. And it's also a stepping stone towards countering perfectionism. So as you mentioned, this is a fairly ubiquitous plague of our mental health at the moment, and probably has been for some time. So perfectionism, as you will know, is not being perfect. It's actually better described as caring too much, trying too hard, and often the result of a bit of a chain reaction. So people might be familiar with the concept of a chain reaction in chemistry or biology, but in psychology it occurs as well. And quite often we see somebody presenting with, say, anxiety. But if we ask ourselves, well, what's behind that? And what's behind that? And what's behind that? We quite often arrive at, and certainly in my work I see, and in myself, a chain where underlying low self-esteem which can be there for all sorts of reasons, can lead to people developing perfectionist traits. So if you think about it, if underneath you are lacking in confidence about your own self-worth, then really the only way of coping with that is trying to prove yourself, or trying to pin your worth on some external validation. So it might be, as long as I've got a really good job, I must be all right. As long as I'm thin, I must be all right. As long as everybody likes me, I must be all right. As long as I always do the right thing, as long as I get good marks, I must be all right. And of course, that sets up a very precarious sort of status quo, where your sense of feeling all right about yourself is contingent on something that you can't always control.
So in a sense, we're
So,
always setting ourselves up to fail, or to fall short. And you're suggesting that, through the process of practicing something like bread, which is a process that is just always fallible, we get to kind of experience those failures in a safe environment almost.
that's right. And I think that for many of the psychological qualities and strengths and resiliences that we, that benefit us, we can practice them in everyday small things and take those small baby steps towards being able to cope better.
I want to just crank you back slightly there, because I think you've got a reading for us, which actually talks us through a little bit of your early introduction to bread, which I think, bearing in mind that we're now listening to you talking about the range of breads and experience of bread and your connection with bread, it would be very interesting to hear at this juncture where that sort of started.
Okay. So this passage I'm going to read you is, I suppose, explaining why I'm not a lifelong bread maker. It's something I've come to relatively later in life. So going back to my childhood, I sometimes lose track of time when I'm baking bread, and it reminds me of how, as a child, I would lose myself in reading. An early literary memory is the description of bread in Joanna Spyri's Heidi. I was fascinated by the hard black bread and the cheese wrapped in a cloth that Heidi was given to eat by her grandfather in their mountain hut. And then the soft white rolls she loved at Fräulein Rottenmeier's house. I remember being in awe of her self-sacrifice and giving up the pleasure of eating the delicious bread to save the rolls for Peter the goatherd's grandmother back home. My perspective would be different now, and my adult self would yell at Heidi, "Eat the bread." Growing up, my grandfather didn't live in the Alps, but in Sunderland. And my parents, my 5 siblings, and I would visit him for tea every Sunday. He used to buy us each a miniature Hovis loaf. They were about 5 centimetres long with the logo raised on the side. And I loved each little loaf. The desire to preserve its wholeness pitted against the urge to cut it into tiny slices and wolf it down. Brown bread was a bit of a rarity for us. It would be neat to be able to tell you about my mother imparting the joy of bread making to me in clouds of flour and affection, but she did not bake bread. She bought Mother's Pride white sliced bread, and I loved that too. So I came to bread making fairly late in life, and I see this, at least partly, as being the result of a 1970s girls' school polarized take on feminism. The choice seemed to be between Simone de Beauvoir and the Stepford Wives. This meant that anything to do with household tasks had to be shunned at all costs to avoid the dreaded fate of ending up as some sort of domestic slave. It took me a long time to realise that baking bread and freedom of choice were compatible. I moved gradually from realization to feed my family to a realization that I actually enjoyed messing around in the kitchen for hours, and time would fly in the same way as it did when I was lost in a book. Baking bread started to take a central role in my cooking, and on the eve of a day off work, I would fall asleep thinking about what sort of bread I might start making in the morning. If I had some dough rising, I might sneak downstairs to have a look at it in the middle of the night. I hope that this excitement in making bread never leaves me, and that this book might help you to find it too.
That's lovely, Pauline. Thank you, and very amusing. I'm sure that many women of a similar age will identify with that thing of the sort of categoric choice. I remember how we had to do either needlework or Latin when I was at school. And so yes, I think that's very, very well spotted. Now, that it gives us a little insight into actually, that first early connection with bread through literature, through just enjoying it, and your book is interspersed with lovely recipes. And I have made the soda bread. I had hoped to make a loaf before we spoke this morning, but to be honest, I just hadn't had time. But the book's interspersed with recipes, and it walks us, the reader, through those recipes and being mindful. And you've talked a little bit about the psychology behind mindfulness. And I mean, it's a term that's bandied about an enormous amount now. And I've almost stopped hearing what it means, actually. So I wondered if you could just express in sort of quite layman's terms what you think how we can interpret mindfulness, and how easy is it to engage in that in making a loaf of bread?
Well, it's such a good question, Jackie, because it's one of those things that has become so ubiquitous that it somehow, is a risk of losing its meaning. So at the simplest level, as you all know, it's to do with being able to be in the moment, to be present. But it's not at all easy. So sometimes something can be simple, but it's really quite difficult to do, especially because we're just so used to multitasking, being overstimulated really by messages and screens all around us. So it's very, very good as a way of relaxing and calming down and slowing down, but it has other really, really quite potent uses as well. And I'll come on to that. But the simplest way to approach mindfulness is to try and do one thing at a time. And it's incredibly difficult. We're so used to doing lots of things at the same time that it can actually be almost anxiety provoking to slow down and stop and just do one thing at a time. And I'm as guilty of this as anyone, of brushing my teeth while listening to the radio, while talking to somebody, while thinking about something else. So trying to slow down, and actually the practice of doing one thing at a time, is in itself very helpful. The second thing is to concentrate on your senses. So although, as I say, we're used to multitasking, the reality is that we can only really properly focus on one thing at a time. When we're multitasking, we're not really focusing on all those things. We're jumping from one thing to another. So focusing on one thing at a time and really focusing on our senses. So if we're focusing on our senses and what we can see and hear and smell and feel, especially when we're doing something physical like making bread, then we're able to pull our attention away from worrying thoughts or thinking about something in the future and keep on bringing our attention back to what we're actually doing. And because bread making is such a rich, multisensory experience, it gives us lots of opportunity, lots of things to focus on, lots of things to concentrate on, to pull our attention back to what we're actually doing. And the reason why mindfulness is very much more than just a relaxation tool is because it's helping us to train our attention. So our attention is one of the most precious assets we have, very much undervalued, but very much valued by social media companies and other people who want to steal our attention from us. It's also something that's stolen from us by depression and by anxiety, when instead of our mind and our focus and our attention being on what would be helpful for us to be thinking about, it's being pulled onto some worry about what if something happens in the future, or how awful the thing was that happened last week. So the better we are at being able to control our attention, and actually it's our attention which effectively creates our consciousness. So the world that we experience is formed from what we give our attention to. So the more we can pull into conscious control, this ability to manage our attention and put our attention where we want to put it, then it gives us a certain freedom to be able to manage and regulate our emotional state in a way that's actually very helpful and very useful for our mental health. So it's very much more than just a relaxation technique. Does that make sense, Jackie?
It makes sense to me, and I'm sure that if our listeners have questions about that, they will submit them in the chat box, and we can talk about that in the Q&A session in about 20 minutes' time. I think that's really helpful for me, because, as you say, it has become an ubiquitous term. It's a little bit like seeing that advert that's always there. You stop seeing it. So I sort of feel as though I've stuck my fingers in my ears a little bit about mindfulness. So that's really helpful. And I found that in the book, particularly the steps you walk through, and just thinking it, sort of moving slightly in a different direction, perhaps, but linking that to things such as emotional eating, which you talk about. And I think that maybe there's a way that those two things and the process of actually making real food and eating real food is connected?
Absolutely. I think both being aware of where our food comes from, and that's related to maybe might seem like an odd thing for me to say, but that food is too cheap, that we don't value food properly, and that by making and by particularly making our own bread, aware of this relationship with the soil and with the farmer and with the miller, and and we use that flour to make bread, and so there's something very fundamental about literally grounding about it, so that awareness helps us to make good quality decisions about the food we eat. And a consciousness and awareness of what we're doing when we're eating and mindfulness when we're eating is another thing that can contribute to a healthier relationship with food. I mean, we all have an emotional relationship with food, and clearly, it can be really quite a significant issue for people. And when eating disorders are a significant issue, then actually medical and psychological help is very important. But just on an everyday level, if we understand ourselves better and we can understand what function food is playing in our lives, if we're using food as a reward or a comfort or a punishment, we need to know what it is we're doing so that we can actually find other ways of providing those things for ourselves if eating has become something that's a bit problematic. And one of the ways of doing that is being aware of what's going on. And I'm sure everyone's familiar with this idea of when we're doing lots of things at once, and one of those things is eating. So, we're watching a film and we're eating and we're doing something else, then we're much less likely to be paying attention to what we're putting in our mouths and how much we're putting in our mouths. So enjoying food is something which I think is so, so important. It's such an incredible gift that we have from the earth. And it's such a great, great pleasure. And making the most of it, being aware of it, being mindful of what we're eating, I think is one of the things we can do to help ourselves to have a healthy relationship with food.
I'm quite interested in the idea that, at one time, making bread was the staple of every household. It was something that, and in particular, everybody tended to have bread made either by themselves or in their homes. And that somehow, I don't know, with this sort of like sourdough lockdown explosion, I think this has maybe heightened a sense that somehow it's become a bit of an elitist playground in a strange way. I mean, maybe that's a bit extreme, but I just wonder how we've got to this point.
It is fascinating. I mean, the history has lots and lots of ups and downs. And as you say, people started off making their own bread. Most people, bread was wholemeal bread. White bread was for the elite because it was more expensive. And then I suppose, industrialization has very much changed our relationship with work and food production. So it's become normal to not make your own bread. I think that there are all sorts of commercial pressures at play there. And, I talk in the book about homemade, good quality bread and over-manufactured, over-refined bread that you would get in a plastic bag from a supermarket, like I used to eat when I was little, being like chalk and cheese. And they are very, very different. They're just, there's no comparison, really. And things have come full circle in that artisan-made, beautiful bakery baked sourdough loaves are beyond the purse of many people. But in a way, I suppose what I'm saying is that making your own bread is a way of re-democratizing that and maybe, rebalancing that so that real good quality bread should be available to everybody. And I think it's really interesting what you say about COVID and lockdown, because one of the things that's not surprising me is the way that people have turned to bread making. And I think that's, across the spectrum. I think it's, it's not a narrow thing, but it's clearly not to do with feeding our stomachs, because there was no shortage of bread. There became a shortage of flour because people felt driven to make bread. And I think it's clear that was meeting a deep psychological need. So people were making bread because we're living at a time where there's a great sense of anxiety, of threat. And I think we very naturally have been gravitating towards and drawn to activities like bread making, but also like gardening and growing vegetables and walking in nature that inherently are quite surrounding. So when we're in a challenged situation, we seem to recognize that there are certain things that will remind us of home, will give us a sense of safety, a sense of belonging. And baking bread, I think, has done that for people. And I think it's rather marvelous that people have naturally known that that was something that would be good for them psychologically. So great that people have been, filling their bread bins with lovely homemade bread, but they've also been filling themselves with a sense of safety, of home, of belonging, of being grounded. And that's something that we all need in these times.
Well, just a little aside there. I mean, I happened to hear your interview on Radio 2 with, who's the DJ, Pauline?
Adrian Chiles.
That's right, Adrian Chiles. He was pretty combative about it, and he made me, he was sort of saying, it's not. He finds it really stressful. It made me think of my husband, who was baking sourdough through lockdown, and I'm afraid that we, his lovely family, mocked him quite substantially for his efforts, which was quite cruel but quite amusing. And he got very disheartened by it, not by us particularly, but he was disappointed in his sourdough attempts. I mean, he felt that everyone else's loaves were more plump and more kind of gorgeous than the things that he was turning out, which actually tasted lovely, and we all really enjoyed them. So, I mean, can there be a bit of reverse psychology going on here, or is that's part of this process of establishing this sense of who we are and how we respond to things?
Well, that's right. And I think that whenever we're starting to do something, when we're learning a musical instrument or a language or making bread, we need to be able to tolerate not being very, very good at a thing. One of the ways of defining stress is demands being made of us. And if we've got all the resources that we need to meet those demands, so we've got in the case of bread making, we've got the ingredients, we've got the oven, we've got the recipe, we've got the know-how, we've got the experience, we've got the confidence, then we're more likely to be able to do it. When we're starting off doing something, we don't have all of those things. So having the ability to tolerate things not turning out quite as expected, this ability to accept the imperfect loaf, which I'm suggesting in the book, represents the imperfect life that we all live, is something that we can change inside of ourselves. So the answer isn't to bake the perfect loaf. The answer is to increase your ability to tolerate the imperfect loaf. So not giving up is really important. And it reminds me of Bake Off, which I'm sure many people will have watched as a British television programme about a baking competition. And I'm fascinated with the psychology of that. And of course, what they do in that programme is artificially create the stress. So they deny people two of the resources they need: one, enough time, and two, adequate instructions for the thing that they're going to be making, say in the technical challenge. So they're creating the drama and the jeopardy by deliberately denying people the resources, so creating stress. Because of course, if they had all the time in the world and really clear instructions, it wouldn't make good TV because, And then the other thing is, I think at another psychological level, when we're watching a program like that, we tend to identify with one of the contestants. It might be someone of different gender and age to us, but something in the person will resonate with us. We'll feel something of ourselves in them. So they will become the one that we're sort of following. So there's more than one. And then, of course, vicariously experience the sibling rivalry that goes on between this ever-diminishing group as they desperately try and win the approval and affection of their parents, Prue and Paul, and we join them in that. So I think it's a program that I love, and it's not just to do with baking being fun and lovely and delicious. It works on lots of levels. I think it's a very clever program, but stress is integral to that.
Yes, to making good TV. Funnily enough, I was going to ask you about the programs like MasterChef and Great British Bake Off, and say, do you think that that's improved our relationship with making food, or exacerbated this idea that somehow it's something that other people do much better, so it's better to just go and buy a ready meal or a loaf of sliced white rather than trying to get into it?
I think we have quite a paradoxical relationship with these things, Jackie, and one of the phenomena which has been observed is people spending a lot of time watching other people cooking on television programs, but actually not doing it themselves. But I suspect that there is some encouragement to people to try and bake things themselves.
Now, I'm not sure. I think you had another reading, but now might be quite a good time. But I'm not quite sure if you feel it chimes with where we are in our chat.
Well, maybe we could just end up with a little one.
Okay. Well, so we'll carry on. I mean, do you actually really bake a loaf of bread every day? Because your Instagram feed makes me feel that you do.
I bake twice or three times a week, but every day I'm doing something. Every morning I get up and I do something to do with bread. So it's a little bit like a repertory theatre that has, one production in preparation and planning, one in rehearsal, and one in performance. So I usually have something that I'm about to mix and plan and what I'm doing, something else that's proving, and something else that I'm ready to bake. So I'm always baking bread, but I'm not actually physically baking every day. If that makes sense.
Yes, it does. You mentioned in your first reading that you're the oldest, I think, of six siblings, and you, I know, have six grown-up children, and obviously your husband. Do they ever rebel against your delicious home-baked bread, Pauline?
No. I'm very lucky in that department that they're very happy to eat it all. Bread freezes very well as well, so if things don't get eaten, I will freeze them. But no, and in fact, a number of my grown-up children have started baking bread themselves, and actually my grandson as well has started baking bread. So that's rather wonderful, this sense that I'm inspiring other people or encouraging other people to have a go at something which sometimes seems a bit scary. And I suppose that's one of the main motivations for me writing the book, that I feel I've benefited hugely from the craft of bread making and wanting other people to enjoy that and get the benefits too. So yes, no protests yet.
No rebellion. But I want to move on a little bit about the process of writing a book without, I think, being indelicate. I should say that, this is your first book and you're 63. What an amazing thing to have written and had published on both sides of the Atlantic, a brand new book, which obviously you've been presumably hatching over many years. Did you realize you were hatching this book, or how has that sort of occurred?
Well, it has been a little bit like a long proving sourdough loaf, in that, the idea was there. I suppose in recent years as a therapist, then bringing together this passion for bread making and the understanding of the therapeutic benefits of it. And then I suppose like many people, I had an idea that people wrote books when this sort of pneumatic precious writing got to the point where it's written. And of course I'm completely wrong about that. And actually I wrote the book when I felt I had something really important to say, that I really, really wanted to say. So writing the book, the tricky bit, I suppose, and I'm thinking particularly of nonfiction here, is the structure, is the operating principle. So I knew what I wanted to say. I knew the tone and the feel I wanted the book to have. I mean, I think of bread making as very nurturing and nourishing and warm and kindly, and to do with expressing love, really. So I wanted the book to be like a warm loaf of bread that had that same feeling. So I was clear about the tone, I was clear about what I wanted to say, but I wasn't clear at first about how I would structure it. And there were, I thought through different possibilities of different sorts of bread, different stages of the bread making process, but alighted on a structure that was based on the different aspects of bread making and other activities as well that contribute to our well-being and to being well mentally, whether we have mental health problems or not. So those were things like mindfulness, good self-care, creativity, learning, connecting with other people, being true to ourselves. And so once I had that operating principle, then it's like writing an essay when you've got a really good essay plan. And people may or may not be aware that when you're writing a non-fiction book, you don't have to write the whole book before you start to approach agents or indeed publishers. So I was very fortunate to get a very good agent who was able to steer my book towards some publishers a number of publishers who were interested in it. So at that stage, full chapters, I wrote a proposal that outlined the idea of the book, who it was for, why I was writing it, why I was the right person to be writing it. And then quite a detailed chapter synopsis, so, say side of A4 for each chapter. So that actually by that stage, it's there. So the writing of the book was a pleasure, and I love doing it, and I'm going to be carrying on writing. I think the biggest learning for me has been to do with promoting the book. So, all the way through life, as I've said before, we keep on learning things about ourselves. So you might have thought that writing the book would be the hard bit, and then the promoting would be something that was fairly easy, but absolutely the opposite. And so what I've learned about myself is that when I was starting to need to do interviews and things like that, I felt absolutely terrified. And I'm not talking about, the normal sort of nerves anybody would have before being interviewed on the radio or something like that. But I felt sick. And when I reflected on what I was feeling, I realized I was feeling terrified that I was going to get into trouble. And I was able to reflect and relate that back to, messages I got in my childhood. It was very frowned upon to show off. Lots of phrases like your boots, being too full of yourself, who does she think she is? All of those things came flooding back, and I think had been there all along, and I think have possibly been responsible for me keeping my head down until I'm 63. So I practice what I preach, which is understanding what's going on and then changing something. So what I've done through the last 6 weeks or so of promoting the book is making myself do it, making myself do the thing I'm terrified of, and of course discovering that I haven't got wrong, as we used to call it, that the sky hasn't fallen, and it's been fine. I can talk about myself, I can talk about my book, and that's all right. I'm not going to get into trouble. So that's a huge learning for me. And I wouldn't have had that happen with the book. So yes, it's not always the thing you think that's going to be difficult that is.
Well as learning those things about yourself, you have shared with us an absolutely fascinating book that not only walks, as you say, us through in a very structured way, the ways that we can explore ourself, our values, our emotional connections, both to food and in other ways to the world around us, through making bread and other activities, as you've already said. It's a fantastic thing. And I think we haven't explored half of the areas that we thought we might, and that's fine. It's like an imperfect loaf. But I just wanted to say that if you had to leave our audience, obviously we're going on to a Q&A shortly, but if you had to leave our audience with one message from the book, what might that be, Pauline?
Well, I think in addition to the life lesson about learning to accept imperfection, I think the other great life lesson that I've gained from making bread is this constant reminder that transformation is possible. So we start off with inedible flour and we end up with this, glorious golden loaf. Here's another one to show you, which is a wholemeal sourdough loaf, here's one I made earlier. And it's a thing of beauty, and it's something that we can give to somebody else and share. And we can make it from flour. And so every time I get a loaf of bread out of the oven, I use it as a reminder that transformation is possible, that change is always possible. And it's never too late, never too late to change things inside us, to let go of some of the unhelpful habits and patterns that we might have carried with us from childhood. Never too late to write a book. So I think that's what I would leave people with. Have a go at bread making. Use it as a way of teaching yourself what you need to learn to help yourself to be well and to make changes that we all need to make, and that it's never too late to make.
That's fantastic. I'm just having a flick through and looking at some of the questions here, and I know you're happy to take those questions. So shall we have a little look at what people have been thinking and asking during our conversation? So here we go. Someone just says here, Diana says, I've tried twice to make sourdough bread and ended up with frisbees. What's the secret, Pauline?
Patience and practice. And I think the key thing with sourdough is the health and the vitality of your sourdough starter. So your sourdough starter you make from flour and water. And we need to have that really robust and properly bubbling before we use it to make bread. And one of the simplest ways we can do that, once we've gone through the process of making our starter, and usually after about a week or something, it's bubbling, it's actually fermenting, it's good to go. But then to double feed it. So if we were going to be baking bread tomorrow morning, then we might feed our starter at lunchtime today, and in a few hours it'll start to bubble up. But then to actually feed it again in the evening, so to get rid of it, I don't throw it away, I keep it all in the tub in the fridge, I don't want to waste it, and feed it again, then it's going to be even stronger. So one of the things about feeding a starter is that it's very tempting to use quite a lot of starter and a little bit of water and a little bit of flour, but actually you need a tiny bit of starter. It's better to give a lot of food to a small amount of starter. So that could be one of the reasons why your bread hasn't got that rise. But if you in my book, I've given really, I hope, precise and clear of all the processes to go through. So if you follow that maybe would help.
And here I've got a question, Pauline, from Louise, and she says, is the therapeutic value of bread making the same as with gardening? We talked a little bit about this, of course, maybe except that the creative aspect of bread making has a much faster turnaround.
Well, I think there are so many things that take an awful long time that we sort of don't get to see the finished product. So one of the things that I think is very satisfying about bread making is being able to see it through from start to finish and have that lovely satisfaction, sense of fulfillment of having made something by hand yourself. So I think that's right. But I think that there are parallels with gardening, with all sorts of creativity, making things grow, that we're making something outside of ourselves, which then people appreciate and reflect back to us. It's something that feeds our own sense of self, in a way echoing the primary relationship with our parent or caregiver as a child, when what we give to them is reflected back to us, which validates our sense of self and teaches us who we are. So there's something about making things which is it's mirrored back to us something of ourselves. So I think there's a deep meaning to it, and I think absolutely right that we'll find that in gardening, we find that in art and writing music, making music. So it's not unique to bread making, but I think there is something about bread making which is very special because of the symbolism, because it resonates with us so very deeply. And it's something our ancestors have always done. People all over the world make bread, so it connects us.
I hope that's really helpful. That's helped me. Here's a comment rather than a question, but it's rather lovely. At Bread Church in Liverpool, around for 20 years, one of our key mantras is "Wonky is good," which came from a Lurpak promotion many years ago. The poster is on the wall as a reminder to each one of us. It reminds us that perfection is in the eye of the beholder. So that's quite nice. Here, linking back to our little foray into reality TV shows like Great British Bake Off, we've got a question here which says, why are cooking programs, and you did touch on this actually, programs and cookery books so popular when most people don't actually put what they see and read into practice?
Well, maybe, again, that word vicarious comes in, that people recognize as something soothing and grounding and reassuring about food and making food. And we all love eating food, so we're giving a sensory reminder of things that are delicious and lovely, and that like the shadows on the wall of the cave, by watching cookery programs and by reading cookery books, we're having a sort of experience, but it's not the real thing. But it's the shadows on the wall. But maybe it's a stepping stone towards people baking, not everybody. But I think that the appeal of those things is because of the deep importance of cooking and baking and bread and other forms of baking and cooking.
And I mean, increasingly, you do see these groups of people who will always do the baking challenge every week, whatever it is. So I suppose that there is an engagement of creativity that it does engender. Now, here's an interesting question, I think, from Catherine. It says, can Pauline talk about the essential parts of the bread making process for her? Is there a step that she always incorporates? It's such a developmental process, but most of us have something we cling to as we produce our loaves.
Oh, well, it's possibly a cliche, but kneading is just so lovely. And to be able to sense this subtle change in the texture of the dough as you knead it, I just love it. And there's something very personal about it as well. If you look at videos on YouTube, for example, of people kneading bread, it's almost as if people develop their own personal signature style, and no two people do it exactly the same. And I think that's rather wonderful. And yes, it varies with how sticky the dough is, whether you're using your finger ends or using your whole hands. But I just love kneading dough, and I love that sense of it coming together and starting to become more elastic. And so it would be kneading for me.
Connected with that, someone else has asked whether that's also a good way, kneading the dough, of getting letting out and getting rid of excess aggression and anger, whether that can be a process. It doesn't sound like that's part of your process of bread making, but
it's not. I mean, I can understand people doing that. I think I err on the side of using words to try and work out what I'm feeling angry about, and doing something about it. I think that sometimes, while it's quite understandable, a sort of a physical expression of anger through bashing our dough or punching a wall or something like that is not hugely helpful, because we're not really getting anywhere with it. But if people find it helpful, then that is okay. I have a possibly fanciful idea that there's something about the emotion that we put into our bread which translates into the loaves we give to people to feed them.
Like that wonderful novel, I don't know if you've read it, is it Like Water for Chocolate? Where the emotion is poured out into the food.
Yes, and literally her, tears make the food bitter. And so, so I don't know if you would be able to taste an angry loaf or not, but.
Well, here's another question, and this is: does your book give ideas of how to get into a routine with making sourdough? And did you write the book before lockdown? And do you feel that it's more relevant today?
Well, it's funny. A lot of people have said to me, "Oh, you must have written this book because everyone's baking bread in lockdown." But the reality is that it takes much longer than that to write a book. So it was completed and at the publishers and in the editing process before lockdown began. So sorry, remind me of the rest of the question.
Yes, it was. There were a couple of points in it, wasn't it? It basically says, does it really, I think the core question is, does your book give ideas for how to get into a routine with making sourdough? And the secondary question was about whether it was written before or after lockdown.
Yes, yeah. Well, yes, the sourdough process, I mean, it's a variable feast. Some people will make sourdough bread in 24 hours or less. Others will take 72 hours to make it. One of the things about it being such a lengthy process is that you can build it into your week. So I often do 72 hours bread and slowing down the proving process by having it for 24 hours in the fridge, for example. And that improves the flavour. It becomes more sour, more digestible. We haven't talked at all about the health benefits, the physical health benefits of eating good wholesome bread, but that's another whole story. So yes.
Do feel free to talk a little bit about that, Pauline, if you'd like to. Now, I've got another question for you, but I think there's time for you to just explore that briefly.
Yes. So one of the advantages of sourdough bread, I mean, I've got nothing against yeasted bread and even soda bread. I make all of those breads, and it's the quality of the ingredients which provide the nourishment. But one of the particular aspects of sourdough bread is that the lengthy fermentation process, which is the antithesis of what happens with manufactured bread, which is loaded full of enzymes and extra yeast to make it very, very rapidly rising and therefore cheaper to make. But it actually makes many of the micronutrients more bioavailable. It becomes more digestible because of the development of the gluten and other things in the loaf. So having bread that takes a long time to make, you're going to end up with something that's very, very nourishing. And I think that in relation to our physical health, we're at a time now where we understand so much better than we ever have how our gut is central to every bodily system and our mental as well as our physical health. And key to that is the health of our gut microbiome. So the very healthy microbes that we all have or should have living in our gut. And one of the things that we need to keep our gut microbiome healthy is what used to be called roughage and we would now call fiber. And whole grains are a very, very good source of that. They're very good prebiotics. So including good quality wholemeal bread in your diet, especially if it's augmented with seeds and other brands and things like that, is actually something that is very, very good for your mental health and your physical health, because a lot of the serotonin and other necessary neurotransmitters and hormones and things are produced in our gut. So it's really it's everything. It's everything. So we can be feeding our physical health and our mental health when we eat good quality bread. And the longer fermentation in sourdough is something that can contribute to that.
No, that's really interesting. Slightly parallel but connected exactly to that in a way. There's a comment and a question here. It says, the other connection between gardening and bread making, harking back to our previous question, is that both are about nurturing another life form. The starter is alive, and many people feel their starter is a pet almost. Pauline, do you have a name for your starter, as many people do?
No, maybe I should. I don't know. I haven't named my starter. I'm hesitating to reveal that I actually have multiple starters. So that's possibly a sign of anxiety, the belt and braces approach. I did used to have different starters that were my rye starter and my wheat starter and my spelt starter. But I've of late been mixing things up a lot more. And again, in relation to gut health, diversity is all. So I often make bread with a mixture of 5 different sorts of flours and 10 different sorts of seeds. So I have various tubs of starter, which I sort of rotate and use. and they are so far nameless. It's not that I don't care about them. I care about them hugely, and I often feel that I've, the sort of emergency ward 10, I'm rescuing them when they've got a bit hard on the top or haven't been nurtured for a little while. But they always come back. And if they do go wrong, and very occasionally, this happened to me a while back when something went wrong with the fridge and the fridge wasn't cold enough. And I had some starter that had some pink mold growing on the top, another one that had gone a bit black and wasn't smelling right. And then that's the point of no return. Chuck them out, start again. But that's the worst that can happen. Start again. 5 days.
I think actually, though, connected to your not naming your sourdough starter, you've stopped being able to bring yourself to call the sourdough that you don't use discard. You've started calling it sourdough surplus, which I think is a good suggestion of your intimate connection with your sourdough starter.
Yes. And I value it, and I think you value anything that you've made by hand and you've made yourself. And I think that's a really good thing. I don't think I've ever thrown out a slice of my homemade bread. And yet the statistics tell us that when you're looking at food waste in the UK, sliced bread is one of the most discarded items, and millions and millions of loaves of bread are wasted a day, which is a terrible thing. So one of the byproducts of making our own food and bread is that we value it properly and we look after it. So yes, I don't. Many instructions for sourdough bread involve discarding it, and certainly in the first stage when you're first making your starter, then you discard that. But once it's mature and fermenting and then I always keep the bit that I'm separating out so that I've got a smaller amount to feed before baking. And I keep a tub in the fridge, and when it's full, I make sourdough crumpets, I make cheese crackers, they sometimes just add a dollop of it to other bakes because it adds a subtle flavour. So no, I don't waste it.
Pauline, I think we are beginning. We've just got 3 minutes left until the hour, so I think we're beginning to wind up our session now. You did mention, do you have a shortish reading, or yes?
I was just going to read a little bit from the end of the book, so that we started with something from
Lovely.
The introduction.
Well, I think if that's about a minute, we've certainly got time for that.
Brilliant. Okay, well, this is the end of the book, and it's the last crust. So I started this book with the smell of baking bread wafting through my house, early in the morning, ready for a leisurely weekend or holiday breakfast. This would be a lovely feeling, even if it was just me who was to be feasting on that freshly baked bread, but there is something infinitely better about sharing it with others. The instinct to feed, share, and to connect with people we know and care about is a strong one. The language of food and of bread is a universal language connecting with people who we don't yet know in our immediate and then wider communities. It's also something that can contribute to our satisfaction with life, to our happiness and sense of fulfillment as individuals, and to healthy cohesion and mutual understanding in groups. It's what we are built to do. It is the basis of human existence. This is a self-help book, but helping ourselves is only part of the picture. Okay, so I think I'll leave that there.
That's absolutely a lovely place to leave it. And in the book, you talk about making bread with love and passing it on. And I feel like you have absolutely shared that with us this morning. So I'm sure everybody, our wonderful audience, will join me. And the sad thing of Zoom is that you can't see them, but in thanking you so much for this insight into bread making and to its health-giving mental well-being gifts it can give to us. So thank you so much, Pauline. If you would like to purchase copies of Bread Therapy, which is published in the UK by Yellow Kite Books and in the US by Horton Mifflin Harcourt, it's available from all good bookshops. Please do try and buy it from a local bookshop. Here in Berwick, that would be Greaves on Church Street. I mentioned at the outset of our presentation here that obviously we're online and free the festival this year. We get no government funding or arts funding. And if you would like to donate to support this and our future festivals, then please follow the link in the chat window that the tech host will put up shortly. And we'd really appreciate anything that you could give us to support that. Now, do join the final sessions of the festival later today. There are some cracking events still to come. Now, this does bring to a close our wonderful session on bread therapy, the mindful art of baking bread. Thank you all for coming to our online festival. And I know that you'll all be joining me in thanking Pauline again. Thank you.